Hi guys, this is Mark. This video is about installing Backendless Pro in the DigitalOcean environment. Backendless Pro comes in two different flavors. There is a single server option where all the elements of the Backendless stack run on the same physical or virtual server. And there is a high availability option, which is based on Kubernetes, and it has all the features of high availability. So in this video, we are focusing on the former option, which is the single server deployment. I will be walking through the entire process right from the very start of getting a DigitalOcean account and creating the environment there and running the installation and configuring it. So by the time, if you're going to follow along, by the time you finish, you will have a complete installation of Backendless Pro configured for both development and production use. We worked really hard to make it as simple as possible to get the product installed. The product is quite complex. It has a lot of moving parts, and as a result, quite a lot of complexity associated with it. We try to simplify it as much as possible. And I think we got there. So it is actually quite a straightforward process. There are a few things you need to know, specifically with configuring domains, for instance. So when you have a domain, configuring it that where you enter it in a browser, Backendless console comes up, or the API start working. But we will get through that, and I hope you will enjoy the actual process as well as using Backendless Pro running in your account on your servers. Backendless Pro does not have any limitations that you could see in our cloud version. It is really a limitless edition of the product. And the only limits that it could have are going to be the ones that are associated with actual hardware allocated to run the product. But as far as the actual functional limits of Backendless, there are absolutely none. Before we get started, let's review the actual process of installation of the individual steps at a high level of what the installation will consist of. And for this, let's take a look at the following slide. So the overall installation at the high level will consist of these 5 steps. Step number 1 is configuring your domain or domains. What is a domain? Well, whenever you will be accessing your Backendless Pro installation, you will need to have a URL that you will use to open Backendless console, and you will need to have a URL to address your API calls. It could actually be the same domain, and they will be differentiated by the port numbers. That is certainly one option. Or you could create 2 separate domains, one for console, one for the API, or you could use subdomains. So for instance, with Backendless Cloud, I assume you are familiar with it, the URL of develop.backendless.com opens up the console, or eu-develop.backendless.com opens up the console in our cluster in Europe. And then api.backendless.com is the API URL or domain for the API calls. And likewise, you could have a very similar setup for your Backendless Pro installation. There are various options here when it comes to configuring domains. One option is to pick a domain name and then point it to DigitalOcean, and I will demonstrate how that works. Other options is just to use your domain DNS configuration with whatever domain registrar you use to purchase that domain and configure everything there. So there are different options here, and I will talk about what they are. It is if you are going to change the DNS settings for your domains, I would recommend doing it first, because it will take some time for the DNS changes to propagate before you can start using them. Therefore, if you do it first and then let just DNS do its work to propagate the change, then while you do everything else, by the time you're finished and you can go to the domain configuration again, which is step number 5 actually, the DNS is already going to be propagated and everything's going to be in place. But the first step is configuring your domains. After that, in DigitalOcean, you will need to create a droplet. A droplet is just another word for a virtual machine. So you will be allocating a virtual machine, specifying how much memory and CPU it has, whether it has fast disks or super fast disks, all those options are available, and we will be going through that as well. Once that droplet is created, then there will be script number one that you run to kind of pre-initialize everything for Backendless Pro. It will download a bunch of stuff. It will take care of a lot of complexity that otherwise you would have to do it by hand, but we don't want you to go through and run a bunch of Linux commands. So we created a script that does all of it. Once that script is done, then the next step, which is the step number 4, is running Backendless Pro Manager. Backendless Pro Manager is a new tool that we created. It's with a graphical user interface that will guide you through the actual installation of Backendless Pro. So the step number 3, the pre-install script, is just kind of all the prep work with Docker and a lot of stuff. And then step 4, which is Backendless Pro Manager, is the actual process of installing Backendless Pro. And once it is installed, then the same Pro Manager can be used just to see what's running in Backendless, access logs, change configuration settings, and so on. And finally, step number 5, as I mentioned earlier, it is going to be actually configuring your domains so that when you enter the URL for your console, it comes up. And likewise, the same thing for the API. When you enter the URL for the API in your installation of Backendless Pro responds. So these are the steps. Now, just to visualize the overall setup graphically, in DigitalOcean, there's going to be a droplet. Inside of the droplet, there's going to be Backendless Pro. Then you will have console URL and API URL, or really just the domain names. And it could be the same domain name differentiated with port numbers. So there are several options there. So they need somehow to reach out and talk to Backendless Pro. And for this, you will be setting up a load balancer in DigitalOcean. And then we will be configuring the domain names to point to load balancer. And then the load balancer will be configured to point to your Backendless Pro installation. So this is the scope of this video, is just getting all of this in place. With everything that the scripts do, it will actually take less time to get everything installed than the intro that I have just recorded and you've watched. So let's just get started and get Backendless Pro installed in DigitalOcean. What you see on the screen is my account in DigitalOcean. When you register and you sign in, and you create your first project that will look very similar to this. And here, the very first step will be creating a droplet. So from this create button, click and select droplets. You will be presented with an interface where you will be creating a droplet. So here you can choose a geographic region where that droplet will be running. Pick the one that will be the closest to the majority of your customers, just because the network lag will be the smallest. And here I will select New York. So New York has these 3 data centers. I'll just pick data center 1 because to be honest with you, I don't really care what data center in New York it is. And then what you need to do is select the actual image. You don't need to select it because Ubuntu is selected by default, and that's what we are going to use. The version here is as of the time when I record the video, the latest is 22.10. The development team, the Backendless development team instructed me that you should select the LTS version. However, when I was preparing this video, I selected this one and it worked just fine. So here, if you don't really care whether it's LTS or not, just select whatever the latest one is. But if you start running into the problems, because in the future versions, of course, will change, make sure to select LTS because this is kind of the guaranteed tested version that is ready for production. So next is the CPUs. So there are 2 different droplet types. There is a shared CPU and there is dedicated CPU. The dedicated CPU will give you more performance because that CPU is going to be strictly allocated to your droplet. So, and then you can read about different types of the dedicated CPU that is available here. The basic CPU will work just fine. However, depending on the traffic that your application will generate, this needs to be a consideration that you give to decide whether you go with a shared CPU or dedicated CPU. By the way, there is a description right here of what the basic CPU means, and it says basic virtual machines with a mix of memory and compute resources, best for small projects that can handle variable levels of CPU performance like blogs, web apps, and dev test environments. And if you select others, it will give you an explanation of what they are. For the demo purposes, as I'm doing now, basic will work just fine. And then as far as the additional CPU options, you can choose between regular, premium, and then premium AMD. Again, for what I'm doing right now, regular will work just fine. If your application is more resource intensive, go with the options that will give you more performance. As far as the actual option for how much memory and CPUs it needs to have, 8 gigabytes is going to be the smallest that you need to select. So it has to be at least 8 gigabytes right here. And then SSH key. So I already configured my SSH key, and that is required in order to be able to log in to your machine, to your virtual machine, and perform the command lines that you will need to run. We will get there. So configure that SSH key, and then when you click on new SSH key, you get the instructions of how to generate them. So this process was very straightforward. You should really not run into any problems with generating your SSH keys. So then select the SSH key that you will use, and after that you can assign the host name. Well, this is the host name that is assigned by default. Make a note of this because you will need to use it later. The way I used it is I just remember that it has the word NYC, which is New York City, in the name, and that's how I was able to look it up later in one of the future steps. And after that, once you either assign a host name or make a record of it, then just click Create Droplet, and then DigitalOcean goes to work to create the droplet. So it will take, I think, less than a minute when I tried. Okay, so while it is installing, I kind of skipped step number 1 for setting up the domains. And while it is doing this, I'm going to switch to my GoDaddy account where I configured a domain called backendless.biz, and that's the domain name that I will use in this demo. So with the domains, there are a couple of options that are available. You can use single domain for both console and API. And if you use a single domain, then you will need to differentiate by the port number. So for instance, when you type in backendless.biz, as I have it here, you could say, well, console is going to open up. And when you say backendless.biz, and then some port number, that will be the API endpoint. Alternatively, you could have 2 different domains, one for console, one for the API. And then another alternative is to create subdomain names. So for instance, it could be develop.backendless.biz for console and api.backendless.biz for the API. All of those options are supported, okay? The decision that you will need to make is whether you configure everything here on the DNS side, in this case I have it in GoDaddy, or you do everything on the DigitalOcean side. In this demo, what I decided is basically do everything on the DigitalOcean side. And for this, the handoff of the DNS management is done by changing the name servers associated with that domain. So in GoDaddy, I went to name servers, and then here I assigned these name servers as the ones that are basically powering up that domain. And they are NS1, the DigitalOcean.com, NS2, NS3, as you can see right here. If you don't use GoDaddy and you use some other domain registrar, then you will have similar interface. It will not look the same, it will look different, but you will have an option to assign name servers or control the actual DNS records associated with that domain. So if you're moving it to DigitalOcean, make sure to do it first before you actually start creating droplets. But I decided to do it while the droplet is being created just to save some time. So here, this is my setup, and the rest of the domain configuration will happen on the DigitalOcean site simply because I handed it over to DigitalOcean by assigning these name servers. Let's go back to DigitalOcean. So in here, the droplet is now set up. As you can see, this is the IP address that was assigned to the droplet. And now when you click on it, you will get some charts. Right now they're empty because there is really nothing going on in that virtual machine. So the next step will be to click on console. That opens up a window where you will access the actual terminal window of that virtual machine. And in here, and then the reason I was able to do this is because I configured SSH keys, which is a prerequisite whenever you configure a droplet. So in here, you will need to run a command line, which is step number 3, I believe, in doing this pre-initialization in order to get to the actual Backendless Pro installation. So that command line is going to be available in the Backendless Pro Manager repository in our GitHub account. So if you go to github.com/backendless, and in here, scroll down to the project that is called Pro-Manager. Go in there, and there will be a fairly long article that talks about a lot of stuff related to running Backendless Pro Manager. And under Ubuntu, you will see this line right here. So click this icon to copy it, okay? And that's the command that you will need to run in order to get everything pre-configured and ready to go before you can actually run Backendless Pro Manager. So now I copied it, and I'm going back to my terminal window and just paste this command line and run it. So this will do a lot of fairly complex stuff to get everything ready to go for Backendless Pro Manager to actually install Backendless. This may take a couple of minutes, I think, or maybe less. So let's just wait and until this is finished. All right, now that the command is finished its execution and we're back to the prompt, then everything is ready. Okay, so everything is ready for Backendless Pro Manager to run. Okay, and at this point, what you need to do is you go back to your droplet in DigitalOcean. And when you go to the droplet, you will know the IP address assigned to it. And when you hover the mouse pointer, you'll see the copy, click copy, and then open a new browser tab, paste that IP address, and do :5050. This will launch the actual Backendless Pro Manager installation. So now no more command prompt, everything's going to be in a graphical user interface. In here, you will select the version of Backendless Pro that you want to install. Select the latest version because that's going to match pretty closely to what's running in the cloud. And then in here, you will need to paste a Backendless license key. If you don't have Backendless license key, click this link. There will be a form that opens up. Fill out this form, and you will get your Backendless Pro trial key that is active for 30 days. And you will need to paste it right here. And that's going to be sufficient to get the installation going. Let me get my key so we can proceed with the installation. Okay, I have my key now. I'm going to paste it in here. And then you also need to create a user account to access Pro Manager. So pick something that you will remember and make a record of this, because these are going to be the credentials that you use to log into Pro Manager later on once you come back to it to manage your installation. So once everything is in place, click the Begin Installation button. So now the installation is running. It will also take a minute or two to complete, and we will know when it's done because it will tell us that it's done. Sometimes you will see log messages showing up that look repetitive, and this is only because the actual install script is waiting for something else to complete, and you will just have to sit and wait till it is done. All right, so whenever you see a message that says all services are created, you can see status of each service on the manage page. That means that the Pro Manager has done the installation of the actual Backendless Pro product. And you can click Manage Backendless, and you will see the following interface. And in here, I'm going to quickly walk you through of what you see here. So on the under Service Status All, this is going to be a list of all the individual components that Backendless Pro installation is made up of. And here there will be a Backendless server, which is the core server, the real-time server, task manager. There will be code runners, which are responsible for running cloud code. There will be the console, which is kind of a directory of all the configuration values, database, Redis. Everything is going to be in there. You want to wait till everything turns green. And once it is, that means everything is up and running and you can access your Backendless Pro installation. By the way, for each of these guys, and by the way, as you can see, they're all green. For each of these, there is a corresponding menu item right here. And if you click on it, then you'll be able to see the actual logs associated with that module. And these logs could be quite important because if something goes wrong, there may be some clues in the logs. And whenever you contact our support and if you're asked to provide the logs for a specific module, then you go into that module, get the logs, and share with our support. So this is what the server status page is. By the way, at the very top, you see there is a web console URL and there is an API URL. So if you go to web console and click on that, that will open up Backendless console. So here you would need to create an account, and I will create one for me. Click register, and then you can create your app. So type in the app name, click create, and now you have your application running in Backendless Pro on your server in DigitalOcean. And this is going to be exactly the same Backendless console as the one you would experience in Backendless Cloud. So at this point, we do have Backendless installation up and running. In fact, let's try creating a table. Let's call it person. And let's say there's going to be a column called name. And let's populate it with a record, Joe, and see if the API is working. So API is working, we got a response. Now, notice a couple of things. So first of all, the URL for the console uses the IP address of the droplet and that custom port that we allocated. Same thing for the endpoint for the APIs. Again, it's the IP of the droplet with the port assigned to the API endpoints. By the way, make a record of the port numbers. It will be important for you for the next step. So for the console, it is 32400 is the port number for the console. And for the API, it is 32300. Okay, so this is going to be quite important, especially once we start configuring our domain names. So you could use those instead of the IP address of the droplet. But at this point, Backendless Pro installation is done. You have Backendless Pro on your server. The next step will be quite important, and that's going to be the step of configuring those domain names. So a couple of things here. If you go to networking, okay, networking gives you an option to configure domains and load balancers. Okay, so the domains, we can actually add a domain here. So let's do backendless.biz, add domain. All right. So since the backendless.biz on the GoDaddy site was already registered and pointed to the name servers of GoDaddy, it recognized it, and now that domain can be managed in DigitalOcean. So here, then we can create additional A records, create subdomains, do all of that. And now that the domain is here, let's start configuring load balancer. So switch to load balancers and click create load balancer. Creating a load balancer is going to be also will require data center region. The droplet that I created is in New York, and it makes sense to put the load balancer into the same region just because they have to be on the same virtual network that is created. So New York is selected, and then you select the number of nodes. Since I'm not creating a high availability setup, I could just get by with a single node of the load balancer. Then you have to connect the actual droplet that is running. So load balancer needs to be connected with the droplet. In here, you can just start typing the name of your droplet, and it will show up in the list selected. And then we have these forwarding rules. Forwarding rules is going to be the most important part that will dictate how that load balancer will operate and how the domain names that you have created will respond whenever you use them, and whether console will open up and the API will respond. So let's try something that is going to be super simple, just a single domain differentiated with the ports. So the protocol that you want is HTTPS, port 443, and here we will need to create a certificate. So if the domain is handled by GoDaddy, if the domain is handled by DigitalOcean, okay, and then it is because I forwarded it to DigitalOcean, then DigitalOcean provides a way to create the certificates. Okay, so that is definitely a benefit of transferring the domain from wherever you registered it first to DigitalOcean, because they have an ability to create those certificates and do all that. But you can actually bring your own certificates, and that is not a problem. I'm not going to be covering that in the video, by the way. So here we will create a certificate for our domain. So click New Certificate, and then search for domain. So this is our domain. And we can create a wildcard certificate, meaning that for any additional subdomains that will be created, that certificate will cover it. Okay. So, and right now we don't have any subdomains. We're going with a single domain for now. So I'm going to call it Backendless Biz as the name of that certificate. Okay. And if you click generate certificate, then certificate is going to be generated. But you can bring your own certificate with this option right here, which I'm not going to be reviewing. Click generate certificate. So the certificate request is pending. Okay. And now it has been verified. So now we're good to go to create our load balancer. However, we're not really done with the forwarding rules. Okay. So in here, the behavior that I want to have is whenever I type in backendless.biz with HTTPS, which is port 443, I want console to open up. Okay. And what that means is that I need to transfer and forward all the traffic that is coming on this port going into load balancer. I want it to be routed to my console port. Okay. Now the console port is 32400. In fact, we can see it right here. Web console 32400. Okay. Which means that in here for this port, I'm going to put 32400. Okay. That's going to be the route forwarding rule for console. What about API? Well, for this, if we use same domain, then we can differentiate with the port. So the port I will use is custom port 444 using the same certificate, and that's going to be routed to 32300. So what is 32300? Let's take a look. See the API 32300. Okay. So what that means is when I type in backendless.biz :444, which is this port, then the traffic is going to go to the API endpoint. Okay. So with all of this, we are ready to create our load balancer. However, there is one more thing. In here in the advanced settings. Click Edit Advanced Settings, and you will see that there is a health check. So health checks are very important. And health check is something that is built into DigitalOcean, and it's a mechanism just to ping a specific port. And if there is a response, it means that whatever we're pinging is alive. If load balancer cannot ping that port for whatever reason, it will actually shut down that load. If DigitalOcean cannot ping that port, it will shut down that load balancer. So here we're going to put our API endpoint as the one to ping. And let's just say that the check interval is going to be like every 3 seconds, just to make it quicker. Okay. And that's going to be the only change we're going to make right here. So now we have a name for the load balancer. Click Create Load Balancer. So now the load balancer is being created, and when it is done, we can actually check if our custom domain is working and if it brings up Backendless console. So for now, let's just wait till this creating tag goes away and the load balancer is functioning. Okay, so we just got a message that the load balancer has been created, which is great. Something to keep in mind is in this status right now, it says collecting. This is actually the result of the health check where it's pinging that port. If you see that it is down, that is not a good sign. I have seen a couple of cases where it was down, but it was actually working. Now, before we test our domain, let's check if the DNS settings were properly configured by DigitalOcean. So for this, go back to the networking and select domains, and then click on backendless.biz. So in here, what you will see is there's going to be a new A record. And what that means is that backendless.biz as a domain now points to this IP address. Now, this IP address is the IP address associated with a load balancer. So it means that anytime I type in backendless.biz, request will go to the load balancer. And then those forwarding rules that we have set up, they will dictate where that request goes next. So this is good. So let's go back to our load balancer. It says new, and let's just try if the domain is working. So let's go with backendless.biz. As you can see, now the console opens up and I should be able to log in to the account that I created earlier. Yes, so now we have that installation of Backendless Pro responding to my backendless.biz domain. So and let's also verify if my API is working. So that should be backendless.biz 4444. There you go. So if you see all works, it means that the API endpoint is responding. Okay. Now, if I go in Backendless console to data, select my table and go to REST console and do show full URL, notice that in here, it is still that old IP address and port. So the question is, how do we change this to backendless.biz 4444? Well, that is configured in Pro Manager. So for this, let's return to Pro Manager and navigate to the, I believe that's configuration. So click on domains and then general. And in here, you see that this is the default settings that Pro Manager came up with. So what we need to do is replace all of these values with the ones that we have configured. So console URL is going to be https backendless.biz. And then API is going to be backendless.biz 4444 protocol HTTPS. Do save and restart. RT, which is real-time server, we will take a look at it a little bit later. For now, we're focusing on console and API. So then if we go back to server status, notice that now we have proper URLs for the both console and API, and let's just wait till everything restarts. Okay, so everything is green now. So we go to backendless.biz and re-log in. And then go to data, select table, REST console, show full URL. Now notice that the API URL is backendless.biz. And let's fetch a record, and it is working. So at this point, we do have our custom domain assigned to our Backendless Pro installation. And it is great, except for one thing. I personally do not like to have custom ports. And I really would like to get rid of this 4444. And one way to do this is to create subdomains, such as develop.backendless.biz to open up console, and then api.backendless.biz to open up, to communicate with the API. And that's what we're going to be focusing on next. If you notice the change of the outfit, what it means is that I'm continuing to record this video on a different date. But the subject remains the same. We are configuring Backendless Pro with two different subdomains, one for Backendless Console and the other is for the API endpoint. The process of setting this up in DigitalOcean really reminded me of chicken and egg problem, because in order to set up load balancer, subdomains need to be there. And in order to set up subdomains, you need to have the IP address of the load balancer, because each subdomain needs to point to a load balancer. So what we are going to do is we will create those subdomains just so they're like a placeholders, configure load balancers, and then we'll go back to the subdomain setup and make sure that they're configured just right. So here, if in my project, I wiped out everything that was there before, except for the droplet. The droplet remains the same. Backendless Pro is running in there. So let's set up our subdomains first. So for this, click on networking and go into domains. My domain is already here. Click on it, and what we need to do is to configure CNAME records, which is the subdomain. The first one will be develop, and as you can see, it automatically populates the rest, develop.backendless.biz. It points, let's just point to the host itself. Let's set up a quick TTL. Click create record, and repeat the same process for the API subdomain. So api.backendless.biz in my case points to the root, and set up shortest TTL. Click create record. So now there are two subdomains, and that is sufficient in order to proceed with setting up load balancers. What I should have mentioned is, with this approach, there will be two load balancers. Each load balancer will be responsible for each of the subdomains. When playing with this, I could not figure out how to make it work with just one load balancer, because whatever I tried did not work. But with two load balancers, it definitely works. So now that these subdomains are registered in DNS, we will go back to networking and navigate to load balancers. So let's set up our first load balancer. It will be in the same data center region. There's going to be only one node in the load balancer connected to the droplet, and set up the forwarding rules. So HTTPS, and this one will be for console. So as far as the certificate, we have this main certificate that covers everything, but I want to create a certificate specifically for the develop.backendless.biz subdomain. So for this, click create new certificate, and let's select our subdomain, and then see, now it shows specific subdomain. So I want this one to be specifically for develop.backendless.biz, and I will call this certificate develop. Click generate certificate. And at the times when I tried, sometimes the certificate, it says pending, and sometimes it is generated very quickly. Like you see right now, certificate has been verified. A few other times when I was playing with this, it took a little bit of time, a couple of hours to be precise, or not so precise. But in most of the cases, it comes back very quickly. So since this one is for develop, which is console, the port for console is 32400. So that's going to be our forwarding rule. Anytime I go to develop.backendless.biz, I want console to open. Also, we need to modify the health check. Again, it's going to be the same port that we configured right here, 32400 for console. We can check, make the interval to be smaller. And this is going to be sufficient. The name for this load balancer, again, to make it consistent, we will call develop. Click create load balancer. And load balancer now is being created by DigitalOcean. Now we will repeat exactly the same process for API. Again, go back to networking, load balancers, and let's start setting up our second load balancer. The process will be exactly the same as with console, but for this, we will be using it with a different subdomain. So again, connect to Droplet and set up forwarding rule. We will configure new certificate for backendless.biz, select API in this case, name certificate so you can recognize it later. Click generate certificate. Hopefully this will go just as quickly as before. So request is pending. And there you go. Now it has been verified, so we can proceed. And the port for the API is 32300. Again, let's set up the health check. 32300, shorter check interval, and assign the name. Let's call it API. Click create load balancer. So now there are two load balancers are being configured. You will have to wait till both of them are done. While it is being set up, while they are being set up, there is something that will be very important, and that's fixing the actual domains. Because what happens is originally we configured these subdomains as CNAME records. However, what would make sense is that each of these subdomains actually points to the IP address of the corresponding load balancer. Okay, so that means that we have to configure A records. So here the host name is going to be develop, and it's automatically develop.backendless.biz. Make sure you are in the A record category. And as you can see right here, it will give you a list of everything that it could point to: Droplet itself, develop load balancer, or IP load balancer. And it doesn't have IP address yet because it is being procured. So now develop.backendless.biz will point to develop load balancer. Click create record. And it says, well, you cannot do it because there is a conflicting CNAME, which makes perfect sense. So what we need to do is delete the CNAME records. I wonder if we can delete it while... yes, we can. So which is great. So now this one we will be able to create because there is no longer conflict. Perfect. So that is there, and API is still being procured. And let's just wait till it is done because I'm kind of afraid to go with it. And yes, so now API is there, and let's repeat this process of setting up the A record for API.backendless.biz. And as you can see, both load balancers are in place. So first of all, get rid of the CNAME. And the whole reason why I created those CNAME records is just to enable the process of configuring load balancer to go through. But now that the load balancers are in place, we can actually set up this mapping. So API.backendless.biz points to the IP address of the API load balancer. Click create record. So now, as you can see, both of these point to the corresponding load balancers. By the way, Backendless.biz itself, at this point, we don't need those records, so we can get rid of them. Get rid of this and get rid of this, because the only thing that matters is that we have API.backendless.biz and develop.backendless.biz pointing to their corresponding load balancers, and those load balancers have the forwarding rules to go into Backendless. So here, everything's good in load balancers. Sometimes I see that it reports this down status. And that's something that I could not quite figure out with DigitalOcean. is that the status of the load balancer may appear as down while everything else is just working properly. Sometimes it reports it as down because load balancer perhaps is being rebooted or restarted whenever changes in the DNS occur. So there is something happening that I could not quite understand, but what's important is that if these steps are all done, if you go through all of these steps, it will work. Now the load balancers are healthy and are up. It may take some time before the domains are actually registered in the DNS system and are propagated. That registration is propagated throughout the internet. And let's try if the domains respond. So let's open a new browser tab and go to develop.backendless.biz. As you can see, it brings up Management Console, and similarly, let's go to api.backendless.biz, and we get this all works. This may not work right away. For me, it took some time, about maybe 30 minutes or so. Of course, the video makes it look much quicker, but it is not instant, and there is some magic going on the DigitalOcean side, perhaps with DNS, but if you did follow all the steps, then this will work exactly as I did show. So now with these two domains in place, if we go back to Backendless Pro Manager, and in here, if you go to configuration and then domains general, make sure to update the setup for the API, actually for both. So for console, it is develop.backendless.biz, and then for API, it is api.backendless.biz port 443, which is the default port for HTTPS. Click Save and Restart. So the data has been saved. And if we go to server status, there will be some restarts going on here just to apply these settings. And once they are applied, then you have two subdomains that are with SSL certificates that point to your Backendless Pro installation. I will wait till this is all up just to verify that everything continues to work, and this will complete this demo. So now everything is up and running. I'm going to close all these browser tabs, and let's just bring up Backendless, develop.backendless.biz. The console is here. Let's take a look at the API endpoint. And the simplest way for that is to select the table, switch to Rust console, and do show full URL. And as you can see, it is api.backendless.biz, make an API call, and we got the data. So at this point, the installation is fully complete. That concludes the demo of installing Backendless Pro in DigitalOcean. I hope you found this useful. A couple of things just to keep in mind. Things are not instantaneous. As soon as you make a registration for a domain name or start a load balancer, create a certificate, things will take some time. So don't jump to say that things are not working if you do not get the result right away. Make sure to verify everything, forwarding rules, mappings of the domains to the appropriate IP addresses, and give it some time. If you followed everything as I did show, it should work. We're here to help. So if something is not working, let us know. Contact us on our support forum, support.backendless.com. And that's going to be it. Thank you for watching this video. And as always, happy coding.